They called it the Crucible. Across the galaxy, there were many military academies, but only one that held a reputation that bordered on myth. The Galactic Vanguard Academy wasn't just a school, it was a forge. It took the strongest, the brightest, the most determined, and it shattered them. No one ever graduated, not once. In nearly 200 years, not a single cadet had passed its final trial. The Vanguard instructors said it with pride. This is where heroes come to die. They wore that failure rate as a badge of honor. It wasn't meant to discourage. It was meant to filter out the weak and expose those who even dared to try. And on a cold morning beneath the twin suns of Tryon IV, a small, unremarkable transport landed at the academy gates. Among the new batch of cadets stepping out was a girl who looked far too ordinary for such a place. Her name was Alira Cade. She was short for her age, her frame wiry rather than muscular. Her uniform looked slightly oversized, like she had borrowed it from someone bigger. While the others walked with stiff, proud strides, children of admirals, nobles, and planetary governors, Alira moved quietly, eyes fixed forward, hands clasped behind her back. She didn't speak. She didn't boast. And because of that, no one noticed her. Except for the instructors. "Recruit Cade," barked Instructor Wren, a scarred veteran with a voice like gravel. "Human, outer rim, no military lineage, no prior training. What exactly makes you think you belong here?" Alira met his gaze without blinking. "Because I'm not here to belong," she said softly. "I'm here to finish." A ripple of laughter swept through the gathered cadets. A few even clapped mockingly. "Finish," one snickered. "Nobody finishes." Wren's lips twisted into something that might have been a smile or maybe a sneer. "Nobody ever finishes," he repeated. "And you won't even make it through the first month." The first month was designed to break spirits. It was called the Foundation, though there was nothing foundational about it. It was endless exhaustion, 20-hour days of physical drills, obstacle courses under artificial gravity, psychological tests designed to push cadets to madness. Half of them washed out in the first 2 weeks. They cried, they screamed, they begged to be sent home. Even those from the most prestigious military families failed one by one. But not Alira. She struggled, yes, she was slower than most. She was often the last to finish the endurance runs, the last to climb the sheer training walls. More than once, she collapsed from exhaustion, her body trembling uncontrollably, but each time she got back up. "Recruit Cade," Wren shouted one morning, watching her limp toward the finish line of a 10-kilometer run with bloodied knees. "Do you think you're proving something by crawling?" Alira spat blood onto the ground and forced herself upright. "No, sir," she gasped. "I'm proving I'm not leaving." It was the first time Wren didn't reply with mockery. He simply stared at her, silent, as she stumbled across the finish line. Weeks turned into months. Cadets continued to drop out. Some were expelled for failing tests. Others quit before the academy could fail them. By the end of the third month, only 30 of the original 200 remained. Alira was among them. And by now, no one was laughing at her. "Who is she?" whispered a cadet from the Arconian Empire during a training exercise. "She shouldn't even be here." "She doesn't stop," another replied. "It's like pain doesn't matter to her." It wasn't that pain didn't matter. It was that Alira had made peace with it. She had known pain all her life, growing up on a forgotten colony where storms destroyed homes and hunger was a constant companion. She had learned early that pain was not an enemy. It was a teacher. And every ache, every bruise, every humiliating defeat here at the academy was just another lesson. One evening, after a brutal week of survival training, Alira sat alone in the barracks. Her hands shook from exhaustion as she cleaned her boots. Across the room, a group of cadets whispered and laughed. She ignored them until one, a tall, broad-shouldered heir of a military dynasty, approached her bunk. "You know you're wasting your time, right?" he sneered. "You'll never pass the final trial. No one does. It's designed to be impossible." Alira looked up at him, her eyes calm and steady. "Then I'll do the impossible." The cadet scoffed. "You think you're special?" "No," she said. "I think I'm stubborn." He walked away shaking his head, but her words lingered. Because deep down, every cadet feared the same thing, that they would break before the end. Alira feared nothing except giving up. 3 months later, they reached the Crucible's gate, the halfway mark of the academy. Most of the survivors were physically unrecognizable from the people who had arrived. Hardened bodies, sharper minds, cold eyes, but even among them, Alira was different. She didn't look the strongest. She didn't speak the loudest, but there was something unshakable about her, a quiet resolve that seemed impossible to crack. On the morning of the next phase, Instructor Wren gathered the cadets in the central yard. His voice echoed off the steel walls as he paced before them. "Listen well," he said. "You stand on the edge of a trial that has destroyed legends. Entire bloodlines have ended here. This academy is older than any of you and in its long history." He stopped, turning slowly toward them, his eyes cold and hard. "No cadet has ever passed." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Some cadets glanced at each other nervously. Others clenched their fists as if daring themselves to believe they could be the first. Elira simply nodded to herself. She wasn't here to make history. She wasn't here to prove anyone wrong. She was here because she had promised herself, years ago, in a collapsing shelter on a dying colony, that she would never run from the impossible. And if this academy wanted to break her, it would have to kill her first. As the gates to the next phase of training opened with a hiss of steam, Elira stepped forward without hesitation. She didn't know what waited beyond those walls: pain, exhaustion, maybe even death. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. One day they would announce those same words again: "No cadet has ever passed." And on that day, she intended to walk back through those gates carrying the proof that someone finally had. The second phase of the Vanguard Academy was not called the Grind by accident. It was a name whispered by those who had survived long enough to reach it, a warning carved into the very halls by cadets who had broken before the end. This was the part of the training designed to crush not just the body, but the soul. The grind lasted 100 days. Each day was worse than the last. There were no breaks, no weekends, no mercy. The instructors called it the reality of war, a place where rest did not exist, where the enemy never stopped coming, and where weakness was a death sentence. And for Elira Cade, it became the truest test of who she was. The first week nearly killed her. They were woken every morning by a sonic alarm at 300. Within 60 seconds, they had to be dressed, armed, and running, or they would face punishment. Punishment meant dragging steel weights across the training field until their muscles screamed, or crawling through ice-cold mud under electric fences until their skin bled. The instructors didn't want speed. They wanted to see who would keep going after the pain started. By the end of the first week, 3 more cadets quit. One collapsed during a forced march and never woke up again. The academy didn't stop. They simply carried his body away and blew the whistle to start the next drill. Elira pushed on. Her legs burned constantly. Her hands were a mess of blisters and torn skin. At night, when she finally crawled into her bunk, she was so exhausted she could barely lift her head. And yet, when the alarm screamed the next morning, she was the first one out of bed. "Recruit Cade," Instructor Wren shouted during a 12-hour endurance run, his voice like thunder. "Do you know why we do this?" "To break us, sir," she panted, her boots sinking into the mud. Wren's lips twitched into a grim smile. "No, to show you who you are when everything is taken from you." By day 20, Elira had learned that pain had layers. There was the pain of sore muscles, which faded with time. There was the pain of exhaustion, which became a dull background hum. And then there was the deeper pain, the one that whispered that she couldn't go on. That was the pain she had to fight every day. During the blind march, a navigation exercise where cadets were dropped into an alien jungle without maps or light, Elira went 3 days without food. Her body screamed for rest, but she refused to stop. During the fracture drill, where cadets were forced to carry wounded teammates for 50 kilometers, she nearly collapsed from dehydration. And during the isolation test, when she was locked alone in a simulation pod for 72 hours with nothing but silence and darkness, it wasn't her body that betrayed her, it was her mind. Voices from her past echoed in the dark. "You're too small, too weak, you'll never be enough." But beneath those voices was another, soft, stubborn, unyielding. "Keep going." When the pod opened, Elira stumbled out on shaking legs, but she was still standing. Half of the others weren't. The instructors noticed. They never praised her, but they watched. Wren, who had mocked her when she arrived, now studied her during drills with a different expression, not amusement, not pity, but curiosity. "Why do you keep going, Cade?" he asked one night during weapons training. It was the first time he had ever spoken to her without yelling. "Because I promised myself I would," she said simply. "And if you die trying, then I die without breaking my promise." Ren was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded and walked away. It was the closest thing to respect she had ever received. By day 50, there were only 12 cadets left. The rest had been broken physically, mentally, or both. Even among the survivors, morale was low. The academy had a way of stripping away pride, hope, and even identity. One night as they sat in the mess hall, silence hung heavy over the group. No one spoke. No one laughed. They were too tired, too hollow. "You know," said Jerk, a tall cadet from the Arconian system, breaking the silence, "I used to think I'd be the first to pass the trial." "You still could," another muttered. He shook his head. "No one passes, that's the point. They built this place so no one ever could." The words hung in the air like a funeral bell. Elira looked around the table, at the bruises, the empty stares, the hopelessness etched into every face. "No," she said quietly. "They built this place to see who would try anyway." The room fell silent again. But this time, the silence wasn't heavy, it was thoughtful. And for the first time in weeks, a few of them lifted their heads a little higher. The final weeks of the grind were the worst. The drills became more dangerous, the simulations more realistic, the punishment for failure more severe. They trained in freezing rain, under scorching suns, in zero gravity and toxic atmospheres. They were pushed past every limit a body was supposed to have. And Elira, she just kept going. She carried injured teammates long after her knees gave out. She stood guard in sleepless shifts without complaint. She stared down instructors who screamed in her face and refused to flinch. She wasn't the strongest, she wasn't the fastest, but she was the one who never stopped moving. On the final day of the grind, Ren assembled the 12 remaining cadets in the central yard. The sky above was streaked with crimson from the rising suns. His face was expressionless, his tone cold. "Congratulations," he said. "You've survived, but do not mistake survival for success. What comes next is worse than anything you've endured. The final trial will make the grind feel like a warm-up." No one spoke, no one dared. Ren's gaze swept across the line of exhausted, battered cadets and stopped on Elira. For a moment, their eyes met, and for the first time, she saw something in his expression she had never seen before. Respect. That night, as Elira lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling, she felt the ache of every bruise, every scar, every sleepless night. But beneath it all, there was something stronger, a steady fire burning in her chest. She had survived what most called impossible. And now, beyond the final gate, the last test waited, the one no cadet had ever passed. She smiled faintly in the dark. Let it come. Because Elira Cade was not here to survive. She was here to finish. The grind had ended, but for Elira Cade, the true war was just beginning. The final stage before the ultimate trial was known among cadets as the breaking point, and for good reason. It wasn't about running or fighting or surviving anymore. It was about destroying what was left of them on the inside. The instructors called it psychological conditioning. But everyone knew what it really was, a calculated effort to strip away everything that made them human, hope, trust, pride, and see who was left standing when there was nothing left to hold on to. Only 12 cadets remained, 12 out of the original 200. They were tougher, harder, and more determined than anyone who had come before them. But that didn't matter. The breaking point had no respect for strength. The test started subtly. One morning, without warning, their daily schedule was replaced with endless waiting. No drills, no commands, just hours of silence in their bunks. By the second day, cadets began to grow restless. By the third, they were snapping at each other. By the fourth, 2 had broken down completely, screaming, crying, demanding to leave. Then, on the 5th day, the alarm sounded. They were dragged from their beds into a combat simulation, one so intense and disorienting that no one knew if it was real or not. Explosions rocked the ground. Gunfire echoed in the distance. They were told that an enemy strike team had infiltrated the base and they had to defend it. They fought for 20 hours straight. And then, when they were exhausted and bleeding, the instructors revealed the truth. It had all been a simulation. No enemy, no mission, just another test. Trust began to crumble. Elira noticed the changes first. Cadets stopped speaking to each other. They ate in silence, trained in silence, even slept in silence. Everyone had begun to suspect that anyone, even their closest allies, might be part of the next trick. One night she found a ration pack on her bunk with a note, "For strength," from a friend. She stared at it for a long time before throwing it away. She wasn't sure if it was poisoned or if the note itself was a test. The Academy was winning. But Alira had always known pain. She had always known hunger, loneliness, fear. What she wasn't prepared for, what none of them were prepared for, was betrayal. On the 37th day of Breaking Point, they were split into pairs and given a mission: rescue a captured ally from an enemy's stronghold. It was a classic simulation. Alira was paired with Jerk, the tall Arconian who had once scoffed at her determination but had since become the closest thing she had to a friend. The mission went well, too well. They infiltrated the base with ease. They reached the holding cell, and that's when everything shattered. The prisoner wasn't a hologram. It was one of their own, Cadet Rien, bound and bruised, clearly tortured. The instructor's voice boomed over the speakers. "Only one of you can leave. The other must remain behind. Choose." Jerk froze. Alira's heart pounded. It was a trick, she told herself. It had to be a trick, but Rien's cries were too real. "Choose," the voice repeated, "or all three of you die." For a long, terrible moment, no one moved. Then Jerk did. He turned and aimed his weapon at Alira. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The shot hit her shoulder. She went down, screaming in pain. Before she could react, security drones stormed the room and dragged them all out. The simulation ended. The mission was over. And Jerk wouldn't even look at her. The betrayal cut deeper than the wound in her shoulder. It wasn't just about Jerk. It was about the lesson the Academy wanted to teach her. Trust was weakness. Compassion was a flaw. And in the end, no one but yourself could be relied upon. Alira spent 3 days in the medical bay recovering. She didn't speak to anyone. She didn't eat. She didn't sleep. For the first time since she'd arrived, she thought about quitting. Maybe they're right, she thought bitterly. Maybe no one can pass because no one is meant to. But on the 4th night, as she stared at the ceiling of the infirmary, she remembered something her father had once told her on their dying homeworld. "Some battles," he had said, "are not about winning, they're about refusing to surrender." She sat up, pain flaring in her shoulder, and she made a choice. She would not quit, not now, not ever. When Alira returned to training, something in her had changed. The Academy had taken everything from her: trust, friendship, hope, and yet she was still there. And that meant one thing: they couldn't break her. The instructors noticed. Ren, watching her during a brutal interrogation exercise, leaned close to another officer. "She's still standing," he muttered, "even after what we did." "She won't last the final trial," the officer replied. Ren shook his head. "I'm not so sure anymore." The last days of Breaking Point were worse than anything that had come before. They faced simulated executions, starvation scenarios, and psychological illusions designed to exploit their deepest fears. In one test, Alira was shown a hologram of her homeworld destroyed, her family gone, her childhood erased. In another, she was told she had already failed, that everything she had endured was meaningless. Each time she whispered the same words to herself: refuse to surrender. And each time she endured. On the final day, only 7 cadets remained. They were ghosts of who they had once been, hollow-eyed, scarred, but still standing. Instructor Ren stood before them in the courtyard, his expression unreadable. "You have survived the Breaking Point," he said. "But survival is not victory. There is one final trial, one final truth, and it will show you what you truly are." No one spoke. They were too tired for words. Ren's gaze found Alira. For a brief moment, his hardened expression softened. "Remember this," he said quietly. "The final trial doesn't care about strength. It doesn't care about skill. It cares about one thing only: whether or not you break." Alira nodded slowly. She understood now. The Breaking Point had not been a phase of training. It had been a mirror. It had shown her everything she was and everything she refused to become. And if the final trial wanted to break her, it would have to destroy her first. That night, as the Academy slept, Alira stood alone on the balcony of the barracks, staring out at the twin suns. Her shoulder still ached. Her heart still carried the sting of betrayal. But beneath all of it burned something stronger, a fire that no simulation, no betrayal, no cruelty could extinguish. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was preparing to win. The morning of the final trial was colder than any Alira Cade could remember. Even the suns above Tryon IV seemed dimmer, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. The academy grounds, usually filled with shouting instructors and marching cadets, were silent now. Only 7 cadets stood in the central yard, stripped of rank, weapons, and insignia. They were not recruits today. They were not soldiers. They were simply individuals about to face something that had broken every soul before them. The instructors called it the trial. It had no official name beyond that. No cadet had ever completed it, so no one knew exactly what it truly was. They whispered about it in the mess halls and training yards. Some said it was a battle simulation against impossible odds. Others claimed it was a survival test on a hostile world, and a few believed it was something far worse. But the truth remained hidden, locked behind the academy's cold steel walls. And now, Illyra was about to find out. Instructor Wren stood before them in full combat gear, a rare sight that made the moment feel even heavier. His expression was unreadable, his scarred hands clasped behind his back. "This is the end," he said quietly. "The last step, the final test. No one has ever passed, not the strongest, not the smartest, not even the ones who thought they were ready." He paced slowly before the line of exhausted cadets. "You will be taken to an undisclosed location. You will receive no instructions, no map, no help. What you face there will test every part of you, body, mind, and soul. And if you fail, you will not return." The words settled over them like a death sentence. No one spoke, they all understood. Wren's eyes lingered on Illyra for just a moment before he turned away. Begin transport. The next hour was a blur. They were sedated, blindfolded, and loaded onto transports. When Illyra opened her eyes again, she was lying on the cold, rocky ground of an alien landscape. A pale red sky stretched above her, thick with swirling clouds. In the distance, jagged mountains cut across the horizon like teeth. There was no sign of the others. No weapon, no supplies. Nothing but the standard academy uniform and a thin wristband tracker. A voice crackled through a hidden comm embedded in her collar. Wren's voice. "Welcome to the trial. Your mission is simple, reach the beacon. You have 72 hours. The beacon is 200 kilometers north. That's all you need to know. Good luck." The line went dead. For the first time since joining the academy, Illyra felt something close to fear. The landscape was hostile, barren, jagged, and freezing cold. The air was thin and each breath burned her lungs. But fear, she reminded herself, was nothing new. She took a slow breath, stood up, and started walking. The first day was pure endurance. She climbed over broken ridges, waded through icy rivers, and scaled cliffs with bleeding hands. The thin air made every step harder, and the freezing winds cut through her uniform like knives. Twice, she slipped and nearly fell to her death. By nightfall, she had covered less than 30 kilometers. Her legs trembled. Her lips were cracked and dry, but she did not stop. She curled up under a rocky overhang to rest, staring up at the alien stars. Refused to surrender, she whispered to herself, one step at a time. The second day brought more than just exhaustion. It brought enemies. They appeared just after dawn, black-armored drones hovering silently between the rocks. They were not training bots. These were combat models armed with stun rifles and tracking systems, and they were hunting her. Illyra dove behind a boulder as a burst of energy scorched the ground where she had stood. She moved low and fast, using the terrain for cover. Every few minutes, she could hear the drone's scanners humming in the air. It wasn't a simulation, this was real. She had no weapon, no tools, but she had learned how to fight without them. She lured one drone into a narrow ravine, then leaped onto it as it passed overhead, ripping out its sensor array with her bare hands. Sparks flew as it crashed into the rocks. She scavenged a piece of its plating to use as a makeshift blade. By sunset, 3 drones lay destroyed behind her, but the victory cost her. A blast from one had scorched her arm. Another had cracked a rib. Every breath was agony. Still, she walked on. The third day was worse. Hunger gnawed at her, her vision blurred from dehydration. Her legs felt like lead. But the beacon was close now, less than 40 kilometers away. She could see its faint glow pulsing in the distance like a star calling her home. And that's when the storm hit. Winds screamed across the barren landscape, lifting sand and debris into the air. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The cold was unbearable. She wrapped her arms around herself and pushed forward, each step a battle against the storm. She fell more than once. Each time, she forced herself up again. By the time she was within sight of the beacon, she was crawling. Her knees were raw, her lips blue from the cold. Every breath felt like shards of glass cutting her lungs, but she never stopped. Not when her body screamed. Not when her mind begged. Not when everything inside her said enough. Because this was what she had come here to do. When Alira reached the beacon, she collapsed against its base, unable to stand. The final light burned above her, casting long shadows across the wasteland. She pressed her trembling hand against the activation panel. It didn't respond. A voice echoed overhead, Ren's voice calm and cold. "The beacon is not the end," he said. "The beacon is a signal. The real test begins now." From the ridge above, shapes began to emerge, drones, soldiers, and towering mechanical constructs. It wasn't over. The trial wasn't about reaching the beacon. It was about surviving after she did. And Alira, bleeding and half-conscious, began to laugh. It was weak and broken, but it was laughter nonetheless. "Of course it isn't over," she whispered to herself. "It never is." The last thing she remembered was standing barely with the jagged piece of drone metal in her hand, staring down a wall of enemies. Her body was finished. Her strength was gone, but her will was unbroken. If this was how she died, then so be it. She would die on her feet. Back at the academy, Ren and the instructors watched the feed in stunned silence. No cadet had ever made it this far. None had ever even reached the beacon. And yet, there she was, Alira Cade, battered, exhausted, and still fighting. "Should we extract her?" one officer asked. Ren shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "She's writing her own ending now." And deep down, for the first time in his long career, he believed she might actually pass. The storm had calmed, but inside Alira Cade, another storm was raging, one of pain, exhaustion, and sheer willpower. Her body was broken. Her muscles screamed with every movement, her lungs burned with every breath. Her vision swam in and out of focus, but the sight in front of her was clear. An army of drones and combat units closing in, their weapons charged, their mechanical eyes glowing red through the dust. The trial wasn't over. It had never been about the beacon. That was just the start. The real test was happening now in this final, impossible stand. Alira tightened her grip on the jagged scrap of metal she had torn from a fallen drone. It wasn't a weapon by any definition. It was a piece of debris, but to her it was enough. It had to be. "Come on," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "I'm still here." The first wave struck like a hammer. Drones swarmed around her, firing stun rounds and energy bolts. Alira dove to the side, rolling across the rocky ground, and slashed at one with her makeshift blade. Sparks erupted as it fell. Another swooped in from behind. She spun and slammed the shard into its sensor core, blinding it before ducking beneath a hail of plasma fire. Every movement was agony, every breath a battle, but she fought like a ghost possessed, a blur of stubborn, desperate motion. One drone clipped her shoulder. Another hit her leg. She stumbled, collapsed to one knee, and screamed through clenched teeth as pain shot up her body. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Her father's voice echoed in her head, the memory of a man who had always believed in her, even when the universe hadn't. "Strength isn't about never falling, Alira," he had told her once. "It's about standing up again, no matter how many times you do." So she stood. The second wave came harder, larger drones with reinforced armor and combat AI that adapted to her tactics. She couldn't fight them head-on. She had to outthink them. She threw stones to distract their sensors, ducked behind wreckage, lured them into close quarters where their size worked against them. At one point, she leaped onto a heavy assault unit and drove her metal shard into a vulnerable joint, ripping free a power conduit. Electricity surged through the air as the machine exploded in a burst of fire and smoke. The blast threw her to the ground. She lay there, dazed and gasping, staring up at the blood-colored sky. "This is it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This is where I die." But then she saw it, the beacon's light, still pulsing steadily in the distance. A promise, a challenge, a reason. "No," she hissed, forcing herself up on shaking arms. "Not yet." By the time the third wave arrived, Alira could no longer stand. Her legs were too weak, her ribs too bruised. So she crawled. She dragged herself through the dirt, swinging her broken piece of metal like a knife whenever the enemy drew close. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't skilled. It was survival in its rawest, most desperate form. And with every blow, every gasp, every heartbeat, something inside her shifted. The trial had never been about strength or speed or tactics. It wasn't about skill or training. It was about the thing that lived deep inside her, the part of her that refused to break. It was about will. When the last drone fell, silence washed over the battlefield. Smoke rose from the wreckage, curling into the blood-red sky. Illyra lay on the ground, her chest heaving, her vision darkening at the edges. She had nothing left, no weapon, no strength, no breath. And that's when the final test revealed itself. A hologram shimmered into existence above her, projecting the image of Instructor Wren. His face was cold and unreadable, but his eyes betrayed something else, respect, maybe even fear. "You have reached the final phase," he said. "There is one last step. Stand and walk through the gate ahead. If you do, you pass. If you cannot." The hologram flickered. "Then you fail like all the others." Illyra turned her head. 50 meters away, through the smoke and dust, a tall metallic archway had appeared. It was the finish line, the end of everything. 50 meters. It might as well have been 50 kilometers. For a long time, she didn't move. She just lay there, staring at the gate, tears mixing with the blood and dirt on her face. Her body screamed at her to stop. Her mind whispered that it was over. "You've done enough," it said. "You made it farther than anyone. No one would blame you for giving up now." But she thought of every insult, every doubt, every laugh that had followed her since the day she set foot in the academy. She thought of Jerk's betrayal, of the instructors who said she would never last, of the plaque at the academy's entrance that read, "No cadet has ever passed." She thought of her mother, working double shifts just to feed her, of her father, dying with the hope that she would live a bigger life, of the little girl she used to be, scared, hungry, forgotten. And she thought of the promise she had made to herself, never surrender. Illyra screamed. It was not a scream of pain or fear, but of defiance, raw and primal. She dug her hands into the dirt and pushed herself up onto her knees. Every muscle trembled, every nerve burned, but she kept pushing. She rose to her feet. One step. The world spun, her legs buckled. She almost fell, but she caught herself. 2 steps. Her lungs seized, her vision blurred, she tasted blood. 3 steps. The gate was still far, too far, but she refused to stop. 4, 5, 6. Each step was a war, each breath a battle. 10 steps, 20, 30. The ground beneath her was slick with blood and sweat. The world tilted. Her legs collapsed. She crawled again, dragging herself the last few meters with trembling arms. And then, after 72 hours of pain, hunger, betrayal, and battle, Illyra Cade touched the gate. The archway lit up in brilliant gold. Sirens wailed. The simulation faded. And for the first time in 200 years, the words appeared on the Academy's central screen. "Trial complete." Back in the control room, Instructor Wren stared at the display in stunned silence. Around him, officers exchanged looks of disbelief. One of them whispered, "She did it. She actually did it." Wren exhaled slowly. "No," he said softly, "she became it." When the transport retrieved her hours later, Illyra was unconscious. They carried her out on a stretcher, her body broken, but her hand still clutching the piece of metal she had used to fight. She had nothing left to give, but she had given everything. And that was enough. When Illyra Cade woke up, the world around her was a blur of white and quiet hums. Her body felt heavy, wrapped in layers of medical fabric. Machines beeped gently beside her bed, monitoring a pulse that had nearly stopped days before. Every inch of her body ached. Every breath was a reminder of what she had endured. She was alive. Somehow, impossibly, she was alive. For a long time, she simply lay there, staring at the ceiling of the Academy infirmary. Memories of the trial flooded back, the storm, the drones, the endless crawl toward the gate. She could still taste the blood in her mouth, feel the dirt under her fingernails. It felt like a dream, too impossible to be real. And then she remembered the last thing she saw before darkness claimed her. The archway glowing gold, the words flashing across the sky, "Trial complete." Her heart began to race. She had done it. No one ever had, but she did. When the door opened, she expected a medic. Instead, Instructor Wren stepped inside. He looked the same, broad shoulders, steel-gray eyes, and a face carved from stone. But something in his expression was different now. The cold disdain was gone. There was no sneer, no mocking smirk. Only quiet respect. "How are you feeling, Cadet Cade?" he asked. Like I got run over by a tank, she rasped, her throat dry and raw. Ren almost smiled. That's about right. He walked to the foot of her bed and stood silently for a moment, studying her like a puzzle he still couldn't quite solve. Finally, he spoke. Do you know how many cadets have stood where you stand now? Alira shook her head weakly. 2,317, he said. From every major world, from noble families, from warrior clans, from bloodlines that trace back to the founders of the Vanguard. And not one of them, not one, has done what you did. His voice was steady, but there was something in it, something like wonder. You passed the trial. The words hit her harder than any blow she had taken. Passed, it still didn't feel real. Then it's over, she whispered. Ren shook his head. Not quite. He reached into his uniform and pulled out something small and metallic. It was an old, worn metal dull from decades of handling. Alira recognized it instantly. It was the instructor's medal, the highest honor at the academy. It wasn't given to cadets. It wasn't even given to officers. It was a symbol passed down from one generation of Vanguard instructors to the next, a mark of their authority, their legacy, their pride. And now Ren held it out to her. This belongs to you. Alira stared at it, too stunned to speak. I don't understand. This medal was given to me when I became head instructor, Ren explained. It's been carried by every commander of this academy since its founding, but after what you've done, it doesn't belong to us anymore. It belongs to the one person who proved that our limits were wrong. Her hands shook as she reached for it. The cool metal felt heavy in her palm, heavier than any weapon, any burden she had ever carried. This isn't a graduation, Ren said quietly. It's a recognition. You didn't just pass the trial, cadet. You changed what it means to pass. The news spread through the academy like wildfire. Cadets whispered it in the halls. Instructors spoke of it with disbelief. Generals and admirals from across the galaxy sent encrypted messages demanding confirmation. Alira Cade, Outer Rim nobody. No lineage, no title, no power. She had done the impossible. They scheduled a ceremony, not because tradition required it, but because history demanded it. On the day of the event, the Academy's Great Hall was filled to capacity. Every instructor, every cadet, every official who had ever doubted her was there. The room buzzed with tension, curiosity, and a hint of awe. When Alira entered, the hall fell silent. She still walked with a limp, her ribs still taped, her body still healing. But she walked tall, her eyes bright and steady. And in her hand she carried the instructor's medal, the very symbol of the Academy's unbreakable standard. Ren stepped forward to address the crowd. For 2 centuries, this academy has stood as the ultimate test of will, discipline, and strength, he said. And for 2 centuries, that test has gone undefeated. We believed it was unbeatable. We believed no one could pass. And so we turned that belief into pride. He turned to Alira, and then she arrived. The crowd erupted into whispers. Some were awestruck. Others looked angry, offended that a human from a forgotten world had done what their bloodlines could not. But Ren's voice rose above them all. She did not pass because she was the strongest, he said. She was not the fastest, she was not the most skilled. What she was, what she is the most relentless soul I have ever seen. When her body failed, she crawled. When her hope died, she created new hope. When everything in her screamed to stop, she whispered one word, no. He turned to Alira and held out his hand. Alira Cade, you have done what no cadet before you has done, and now the Academy's history is rewritten with your name. The hall erupted in applause. Alira stepped forward, trembling slightly, and faced the rows of cadets. Many stared at her with admiration, a few with resentment, but all of them, every single one, looked at her with something they had never felt before. Possibility. 2 years ago, she began, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. I was a nobody, a girl from a broken world with nothing but a promise to myself that I would never stop trying. I came here not to make history, not to prove anything, but because I had something I refused to let go of, the belief that limits exist to be challenged. She lifted the medal high for all to see. This is not a symbol of my victory. It's a reminder of what happens when you refuse to surrender. If I can do this, so can you. The hall erupted again, not with polite applause this time, but with cheers that shook the walls. Later that night, Alira stood alone on the academy balcony, the stars stretched endlessly before her. She turned the medal over in her hands, feeling the weight of it not as a trophy, but as a promise. She had changed the academy, but more importantly, she had changed herself. She was no longer the forgotten girl from a dying colony. She was Elira Cade, the cadet who refused to break, the one who had walked through hell and returned carrying the proof. And for the first time, she believed what she had always whispered in the dark. Nothing is impossible. The day after the ceremony, the academy felt different. The same tall towers and iron gates stood where they always had, the same drills echoed in the training fields, and the same instructors barked orders with harsh discipline, but something invisible had changed. Something deep. Where once the halls had carried the heavy weight of despair, the whispered belief that no one can pass, now they pulsed with a new energy, hope, determination, fire. And it all started with one girl from a forgotten world, now known across the stars as Elira Cade, the first to pass. Elira was no longer just a cadet. In the days following the trial, her name spread far beyond the academy walls. News channels across the galaxy told her story. Military academies on 100 worlds studied her performance. Politicians quoted her speeches. And in places where humanity had long been dismissed as weak or primitive, her name was spoken with a new kind of respect. But Elira herself did not care for fame. While others tried to turn her victory into politics or profit, she returned quietly to the training grounds. She walked the same obstacle courses she had struggled with on her first day. She visited the simulator rooms where she had failed again and again. And when new recruits arrived, trembling, uncertain, carrying the same fear she once had, she was there to greet them. "Do not fear the trial," she told them. "Fear giving up before you even try." One evening, weeks after the ceremony, Instructor Wren found her standing alone at the edge of the parade ground. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. Elira wore no medals, no special uniform, just the same simple cadet jacket she had worn since the beginning. "You don't enjoy the spotlight much, do you?" Wren asked, stepping up beside her. Elira shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I didn't do this to be famous. I just wanted to see how far I could go." "You went farther than anyone," Wren said, "and because of that, everything is going to change." He gestured toward the academy courtyard, where hundreds of new recruits were training. "Applications have tripled since the news broke. For the first time in our history, cadets from worlds that once thought they weren't good enough are lining up to join. And every one of them believes they can pass now, because you did." Elira's gaze softened as she watched the young cadets push themselves, their faces determined, their bodies straining. "Good," she murmured. "That's the way it should be." But her legacy didn't end there. The High Command of the Vanguard, shaken by the news, convened to review the structure of the academy. For centuries, the trial had been considered a final barrier, a wall meant to separate the strong from the rest. Now they began to see it differently. It wasn't a wall at all. It was a door. And Elira had shown that the door could be opened. New training programs were developed, ones that emphasized resilience over brute strength, creativity over conformity. Instructors began to tell cadets not just how to fight, but how to endure, how to think, how to adapt. And above the gates of the academy, a new inscription was carved into the steel archway. "Limits exist to be broken." Months later, Elira stood in that same courtyard again, this time as a guest of honor. Hundreds of cadets were assembled before her, each of them about to attempt the trial. They were stronger, faster, and better prepared than any generation before them, and yet many still looked terrified. She stepped forward, her voice calm and steady. "I know what you're feeling," she said. "I know the fear in your chest, the voice in your head that says you're not good enough. I heard it too, and I nearly believed it." The crowd was silent, every eye was on her. "But let me tell you the truth, it's not strength that will carry you through the trial. It's not power, it's not talent. It's will, the will to crawl when you cannot walk, the will to fight when you cannot win, the will to say no to every part of you that screams to stop." She held up the instructor's medal, the same one she had carried from the battlefield. "You are not here to be perfect. You are here to be unstoppable." The courtyard erupted in cheers. Years passed. Elira's legend grew. Some cadets passed the trial after her, not many, but enough to prove it was possible. And each one who did carried a small piece of her spirit with them. They called themselves the Cade Line, a new generation of warriors shaped not by bloodline or strength, but by an unbreakable will. And wherever they went, from the frozen colonies of the Outer Rim to the vast battlefronts of the Orion Wars. They carried with them a single lesson, that nothing, not even the impossible, was beyond reach. Illyra herself never stopped pushing forward. She rose through the Vanguard's ranks, commanding fleets, leading missions, and shaping strategies that would change the course of history. But no matter how far she climbed, she always returned to the academy to walk the halls where she once crawled, to remind herself where it all began. One night, long after the crowds had faded and the medals had gathered dust, Illyra stood again before the trial gate. The same archway that had once felt so far away now seemed small beneath the vastness of the stars. She reached out and touched the cold metal. It hummed beneath her fingertips, the same hum she had felt when she collapsed there, broken but unbowed. "You were never the enemy," she whispered to the gate. "You were the test I needed." And as she turned away, she knew the truth. The trial was never about proving herself to others. It was about proving herself to herself. In the end, Illyra Cade's legacy wasn't measured by medals or titles. It wasn't even measured by the fact that she had passed the impossible test. Her legacy was measured by the countless lives she changed, by the cadets who stood taller because she showed them they could. And somewhere across the stars, a young recruit looked up at the academy gates for the first time, fear gnawing at their heart. And in that moment, they whispered the same words Illyra had once spoken to herself in the dark. "I will not surrender." Because now they knew no wall was unbreakable, no limit was final, and no dream was too far.